Please be seated. This is a hard gospel this morning in some ways. And you know, sometimes when someone presents something to you, the issue is not the issue, I guess is the best way to put it. Sometimes the issue is really not the issue. Have you had someone come up to you and say, I wish you had done da-da-da, or just a sort of odd reaction from someone? And many times there are underlying reasons for that. There's a deeper issue going on with that individual. And perhaps we ourselves have found ourselves personally doing that sort of thing to somebody else. We're reacting to something that's really below the surface. We're not even conscious of it sometimes. And we don't want to address the issue that is really at the heart of things. Well, I can't help but think that maybe in the gospel today, a little bit of that thinking is going on. The Pharisees come with a question about divorce. It seems straightforward. Maybe they're looking for Jesus to take the side of a controversial issue, or maybe they're hoping to induce Jesus to say something, something that will get under the skin of the authorities, and then we'll be rid of him. We'll get him out of our hair, so to speak. But I wonder if the issue behind their question is less about divorce and more about order. We need order. After all, the primary function of the law is to lend order to a chaotic world, right? Without laws, it seems like everybody goes in different directions. When we think of even running meetings for those groups that use Robert's Rules of Order, it was originally intended and written by an ex-military person to keep people from killing each other. And so it is that we need these structures. They can protect us in a dangerous environment. And for this reason, law is incredibly helpful. Yet up to this point, at least from the point of the view of the Pharisees, Jesus has been playing footloose, fancy-free, transgressing much of what seemed to lend order to their world view. Feeding everyone, not just some. It's interesting that at the beginning of the 6th chapter in Mark's Gospel, this story of the feeding comes right after Herod's very exclusive feast. Or Jesus healing those with illnesses that normally are attributed to sin. Or challenging traditions about the Sabbath. Or praising the faith of the Syrophoenician woman, even if at first Jesus was not too keen on that idea, couldn't even imagine it, and criticizing the Pharisees themselves, the community's regular arbiters of law. So maybe the issue is divorce, or maybe divorce is just an example of, there's something deeper going on. And so the Pharisees test Jesus, just to see how far he's willing to go. And Jesus takes up their challenge, examining both the law itself and accepted the exceptions to it by citing God's intent behind the law. What is that intent? It's none other than for human flourishing, right? We want humans to flourish in life. And God intends that. So law and order are really a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. And Jesus' stance on marriage isn't simply bolstering an institution, but but really supporting an institution that respects and supports the integrity of relationships. And even that is probably not quite the issue. In fact, I'm not sure we can understand Jesus' issue if we don't read the whole story in light of the end of this passage when Jesus welcomes children and their parents. Of course, Mark doesn't really say parents, does he? But it's implied. They were bringing little children to him in order that he might touch them, and the disciples spoke sternly to them. Now, I think there are really two very interesting things about the juxtaposition of these very different verses. First, up to this point, the Pharisees, and Jesus too for that matter, have only been talking about men divorcing their wives. That was the law. Men could divorce their wives under certain circumstances, and more often than not, the result for the women was pretty much total and complete economic ruin and ostracization, which helps to explain Jesus' response. God intended marriage to be a union, a partnership, a supportive and mutually interdependent relationship. And so God's intentions should not be shortchanged by convenience or by a law that allows one member of the partnership to abandon and ruin the other. Yet when speaking with his disciples, Jesus first reinforces what he just said about men divorcing their wives, and then also goes on to give identical instructions about women divorcing their husbands, which, quite frankly, would have been something that no one would have even vaguely begun to imagine, something no one had even thought to ask, something that implies a kind of equality of status. And so, secondly, the other point here is it's immediately after this exchange that Mark recounts the story of the people bringing children to be touched by Jesus. And they could have been parents or single parents or women or divorced women. In any case, it was they, them. And Jesus is indignant at his disciples for trying to stop this action of blessing and healing. Because after all, children were seen in the ancient world as having absolutely no status. And yet Jesus is affirming, I think, God's very nature, where God shows up wherever there is suffering and the dependent and the vulnerable. The kingdom of God belongs to such as these, the balm of Gilead. And so for those who are trying to rebuild their lives after the destructive hurricane, for those who are still finding themselves waking in the midst of war, for those who are suffering loss, God comes to them in particular ways, in physical ways. And one can only imagine the shock in the community as Jesus is saying this. And probably it should shock us as we open ourselves to God's presence. Law is important. Marriage is important. And divorce represents a tearing, a ripping apart of something God had blessed. Everyone who's been divorced or part of a family of divorce or close to someone who has been divorced knows this. So it's not news. And yet, here is the news. The good news is that God regularly shows up to care for those who have been ripped apart, those who have been laid asunder. those who are alone and dependent and vulnerable and suffering and disenfranchised and hurting. And so let's focus our attention on what the real issue is here, and the central issue throughout the Bible, that God is most reliably present among the vulnerable and the hurting and the dispossessed. And if that's where you find God, then that's where we as the church also show up, extending grace, help, and support and understanding and love for those who are down and out, those the culture is prone to leave behind, and those without power, those who are easy to miss. For it is to such as these, Jesus says, that the kingdom of God belongs, and only when we recognize our own dependence and vulnerability, when we associate with the others, and we see ourselves in those who suffer. Jesus goes on to say that we can also receive the reign and the presence of God. Humility, honesty, and openness all lead to a healthy relationship with God. And so the gospel moves us once again to those places. So be it.